Okay. So, we've got a pretty hefty stack of articles here all about The Cure's new album,
Yeah.
Songs of a Lost World. And, you know, I gotta say, 16 years is a long time to wait for a new album.
Oh, absolutely. Fans have been clamoring for this.
Yeah. So I'm excited to dive in and see what we've got. We've got reviews, some background on the band, and even an interview with the man himself, Robert Smith.
It's going to be interesting to see how all of this connects. You know what strikes me right off the bat?
What's that?
This isn't just a new album, right?
Yeah.
It seems like it's a culmination of like everything The Cure has been exploring for their whole career, but now it's filtered through, well, Robert Smith's personal life, the grief, getting older, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of reviews, the Washington Post, they're calling it their best album since Disintegration, which came out way back in 1989.
That's high praise. Disintegration is a classic.
It is, and they even use the word apotheosis to describe it, like Smith been fascinated by, decay and all that.
Disintegration.
It's integration, yeah. And it's like this album is the peak of all that.
It makes you think, right? Apotheosis means like the highest point, the ultimate expression. So are they saying this is the most Cure album ever in terms of those themes anyway?
It could be. I mean, Disintegration, was known for its atmosphere, those dense layers of sound and the lyrics that really went deep on loss and isolation. So to see this new album being compared to that.
It's got to be significant.
Yeah, it is. It suggests maybe a return to that more somber, complex sound. But this time it's informed by everything Smith's gone through. Like, he lost several close family members recently, including his brother, Richard. And the interview you sent over, it's clear that had a huge impact on him.
Which brings up a big question, right? The Cure, they've always kind of explored those dark themes, but in a way that felt almost romantic,
Yeah.
But when you face that kind of darkness in real life head on, how does that change things?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to write about those feelings from a distance, but it's another to experience them firsthand.
Exactly.
And what's interesting? The Telegraph review, they described the album as perversely uplifting in its nihilism, which is kind of a weird description, but
That's contradiction.
it's fascinating.
I think it speaks to how The Cure can find beauty, even in darkness. It's not about ignoring the tough stuff. It's about acknowledging it, confronting it.
Yeah, and finding a way to move through it, maybe even find a glimmer of hope on the other side.
Maybe. And the interviews, Smith doesn't shy away from that personal stuff at all.
No, he hasn't. Especially on that one song, I Can Never Say Goodbye. Apparently, it's about his brother.
I've heard it's really raw, emotionally overwhelming.
Yeah. Even for Smith to perform, apparently.
It makes sense why the critics are responding to this. It's different, right? This isn't just like playing with dark imagery for art's sake. It's coming from a place of real experience, real pain. It hits harder.
Yeah, definitely. It adds a whole other level of depth.
It makes you feel it,
Yeah,
not just hear it.
absolutely. Okay, but before we get too deep into all that, I want to back up a second. The band bio, right? It mentions all these different phases The Cure has gone through over the years. You've got the poppier stuff, like Let's Go to Bed, and then like the more experimental, like The Top.
Right.
So where does this new album fit in with all of that?
Oh, you've hit on something important. So the bio, it actually gives us this timeline of The Cure and shows how they've always shifted back and forth between those extremes, the dark and the light, almost like a pendulum swinging between moods.
Okay. So are we talking more like pornography era Cure then? That was pretty bleak.
Well, there are some similarities to pornography for sure, especially in terms of atmosphere. But I think the key difference here is that the darkness, it's not just stylistic. It's deeply personal now. It comes from Smith's grief, his thoughts on getting older. It's not just Robert Smith, the artist. It's Robert Smith, the human being, facing like the shadows within himself.
The article mentions that Smith's wife, Mary, actually helped him choose which songs went on the album.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Apparently she pushed for some lighter moments in there, amongst all the darkness.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder why.
I know, right?
It's a small detail, but it could be important. Maybe she saw the need for balance.
Yeah.
Even with all the heavy stuff, there needs to be a little bit of light to kind of, I don't know, make it all bearable.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe she felt like listeners would need a break. And speaking of lighter moments, The Guardian, they called out one track in particular, Drone, No Drone. They called it an unexpected pop banger. I'm really curious to hear that one.
Oh, me too. Like, what does a pop banger even sound like on a Cure album like this? Especially one dealing with all these intense emotions.
Right. It makes you wonder if maybe Mary's influence on the track list helped create space for those brighter moments to shine through. Like a reminder that even in the face of loss and all that, you can still find those sparks of joy.
It's almost like a little breath of fresh air, right? Before you dive back into the heavy stuff.
And speaking of diving back in, this is where it gets really interesting. The interview, it hints that Songs of a Lost World, it might just be the beginning. Smith says he's almost finished with another album, a second one. And there could even be a third one waiting.
Whoa, hold on. 3 albums. After all this time, he's suddenly prolific.
I know, right?
If we're thinking about legacy, like we were earlier, well, 3 albums? That's a statement, isn't it? Especially with him talking about maybe ending the band around their 50th anniversary.
That's right. He did mention that. It's almost like he's using this time to process everything and create something that will, I don't know, really cement his legacy.
Yeah, yeah, maybe. Okay, but before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go back to Songs of a Lost World for a minute. We've talked about the themes, the mood, but what about the sound itself? Like, what are the critics actually saying about the music?
Well, the Washington Post, remember, they called it a work of goth grandeur. But what does that even sound like? They mentioned wall of sound production, and they compared it to bands like My Bloody Valentine and Nine Inch Nails.
Hmm, interesting. So you've got The Cure, who influenced all these other bands, and now it's like their sound is influencing The Cure again.
Yeah, it's like this weird feedback loop. The layers of guitars and synths, Smith's voice, it's all become so iconic. It's hard to imagine those sounds not influencing someone like Robert Smith, even if it's his own band.
It's like their own sound is now part of the musical landscape they're working in.
Exactly. And the reviewer used this great phrase, meditation under a black light, which is like the perfect description of the mood. But can we
Yeah.
get a little more specific? Like, what are we actually hearing?
Okay, so they talk about these waves of wiry guitar riffs,
Hmm.
you know, and warm synth pads and these little echoes of familiar piano chords. And get this, they even compared it to the sound of like melted vinyl and a finger pushing down on a cassette tape.
Oh, wow. So it's not just the music, it's also the way it's produced. Like he's intentionally evoking a certain era, a certain feel.
Yeah, that analog sound, it adds this whole other layer of nostalgia to it.
It does. It's like he's weaving together the past, present, and future all into one album. And that makes sense given how personal this album is, right? It's not just about the music, it's about the feeling, the atmosphere that he's creating.
Totally. And, in the interview, Smith actually says that this album is different because of those lived experiences, those losses. He says when he was younger, he romanticized death. But now that he's experienced it firsthand, it's totally different. It's not an idea anymore. It's a reality. It's changed him.
Yeah, yeah. And that probably explains why this album seems to be hitting people so hard. It's coming from a place of like genuine pain, but also understanding.
Absolutely. And The Guardian, they said that the album seems to be wrestling with the question of Smith's own selfhood. Like, who is he now after all this? It's heavy stuff.
It is, but it's also relatable, right? I mean, we all go through loss, we all get older, and we all grapple with who we are at different points in our lives. It's about confronting our own mortality.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And let's not forget, Smith is 65 now, so those themes, they're going to be on his mind. This isn't just about his personal grief. It's about the universal experience of aging, of coming to terms with our limits.
Okay, so we've got this like incredibly personal, emotionally heavy album, but you said there were also moments of pop in there, right?
Right.
Tell me more about that, especially considering how dark and introspective everything else seems to be.
Well, remember how we talked about Mary, Smith's wife, encouraging him to add some lighter tracks? So one of those tracks, Drone, not Drone, it's actually being praised by critics. They're calling it like a highlight of the album. The Guardian even called it a, quote, unexpected pop banger, end quote.
Wow. I mean, I'm picturing like glow sticks at a Cure concert.
Right. Like, how does that even work?
It makes you wonder, what does a pop banger sound like when it's created by Robert Smith? I'm really curious to hear how that fits in with the rest of the album.
Me too. It's
Yeah.
like this mystery, because it hasn't been released as a single yet.
Yeah.
But from the reviews, it sounds like it offers a like a much-needed break from the heavier stuff.
I love that. Like, Mary knew people would need a moment to catch their breath before going back into the darkness.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of intentionality, remember we were talking about this album as a way for Smith to process his emotions, maybe even leave a legacy? Let's talk about that a little more. What does that even mean for a band like The Cure? You know, they've been around for almost 50 years. They've already left a huge mark on music.
That's a great question. I mean, remember how Smith hinted that The Cure might end around their 50th anniversary, which is coming up in 2028?
Oh, yeah. He even said he'd be happy just to see Christmas. I remember thinking, like, wait, does that mean...
Right. Exactly. So there's this sense that time is running out, right? And if Songs of a Lost World really is like the beginning of the end for The Cure, well, it takes on this whole other weight. It becomes like a final statement.
Whoa, a final statement. That's a powerful way to look at it. It makes you wonder what he's trying to say with this album. What does he want to leave behind?
Exactly. And luckily for us, it seems like this album is just the beginning of that statement.
You mean because of the other two albums he's working on?
Yes. It's kind of crazy to think that after a 16-year wait, we might be getting multiple new albums from The Cure in a relatively short time.
I know, it is surprising, especially since Smith has talked about how tough he finds it to write lyrics these days. What do you think caused this sudden burst of creativity?
I don't know, but maybe, just maybe, it's the very things we've been talking about. The grief, the sense of time passing, that need to leave a mark, you know? Maybe those heavy emotions actually fueled his writing.
That's a good point. Sometimes the darkest times can lead to the most profound art.
Exactly. And that's what makes The Cure's music so compelling. They don't shy away from the tough stuff. They turn it into something meaningful.
So we have this album that's both a combination of their past and a potential glimpse into their future, and then we have these other albums on the horizon. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But I think the next step is to actually listen to Songs of a Lost World, right? With all this context in mind. We've talked about reviews and history and influences, but the real experience is in the music itself.
You're right. It's time to put on our headphones, dim the lights, and let The Cure take us on a journey. But before we do that, let's talk about one of the tracks that everyone's buzzing about, End Song. It's the last one on the album, and it's over 11 minutes long.
Oh, wow. End Song. Yeah, that's a good one to focus on. It's like this epic, sprawling piece of music. It really stays with you.
Okay, so what makes it so special? What should we be listening for?
Well, based on some live performances I've seen, it seems to be building on the sound that they established with earlier tracks like Cut from their album Wish.
Cut. Oh, yeah. I love that song.
So we could probably expect those like thudding drum beats and those whirling guitar tones and those unrelenting bass hooks, but amplified, to a whole new level.
Just like Cut on steroids.
Exactly. But what's really striking about End Song are the lyrics. Smith gets super vulnerable, like reflecting on his whole life, and there's this feeling of him trying to, I don't know, reconcile his youthful aspirations with getting older and facing loss. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier there's a line in the song, something about remembering the hopes and dreams I had.
Yeah, yeah.
That's pretty heavy stuff, especially considering where Smith is in his life right now. It's like he's looking back and wondering, did he achieve everything he set out to do?
It's like a moment of self-reflection,
Yeah.
a reckoning with the passage of time. And it really gets to the heart of what this album is about. It's about facing those big questions. Life, death, meaning, purpose. It's about trying to make sense of it all.
It sounds like End Song could be like the emotional core of the entire album.
It very well could be. It's definitely a track that will stick with you.
I can't wait to hear it. But before we dive into the music, I want to touch on those other albums Smith mentioned, the ones he's been working on since 2019. Do we have any clue what those might sound like?
Unfortunately, no. We know he's close to finishing the second one, but as for what to expect, it's a complete mystery. The sound, the themes, even the titles were totally in the dark.
Well, that just makes it even more exciting, right? We have Songs of a Lost World to unpack, and then we have 2 more albums to look forward to. It's a good time to be a Cure fan.
It really is. And before we finally dive in, I want to leave you with this thought. As you listen, pay attention to how Smith uses his voice. It's more than just singing. It's like another instrument, another way to convey emotion.
Oh, I love that. Like his voice is a character in the story, conveying all the nuances and depth of his feelings.
Exactly. It's a voice that can move you, comfort you, challenge you. It's a voice that connects us to something deeper within ourselves.
Okay, I'm ready to hear it now. Let's dive in.
Let's do it. Going through all these articles, what really stands out to me is how Robert Smith talks about the album, not just as like a bunch of songs, but like a personal journey. Like he's giving us a glimpse
Okay.
into, his inner world right now.
Yeah, definitely. It's that vulnerability that's resonating with people. Even when the critics talk about how dark the album is, they still find something positive in it. Like that phrase, perversely uplifting. It's strange, but it makes you think.
It is. It's like The Cure has this way of like acknowledging the darkness, but finding some, I don't know, like a spark of something else within it. Like maybe by facing those tough emotions head on, you can actually find some peace or acceptance.
Yeah, maybe. Like that line from the Telegraph review. A strange kind of beauty and staring right into the abyss. It's powerful stuff.
It is. And it's interesting how this all ties back to Disintegration, that album we talked about earlier, a real landmark album for them.
Disintegration was like a masterclass in mood and atmosphere. So
Yeah.
much loss and isolation in those songs.
Right. And now, all these years later, Smith's revisiting those themes. But this time, it's through the lens of his own experiences, losing his brother, getting older, facing his own mortality. It's like he's taking those abstract ideas and giving them this weight of real human emotion.
Yeah. The Washington Post review, they called it the apotheosis of those themes. Like, this is the culmination, the highest point of his exploration of all that.
It's like those ideas have been haunting him for decades.
Hmm.
And now they've reached this new level of intensity, a new level of meaning.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? We talked about Mary, his wife, encouraging him to include those lighter moments on the album. Like, she knew people would need a break from the intensity.
Right. It's all about balance. Even in an album about grief, there needs to be that contrast, that reminder that there's still light in the world.
Yeah. And speaking of light, The Guardian singled out that track, Drone Not Drone, calling it an unexpected pop banger. I'm really curious to hear how that fits in with the rest of the album.
Me too. It's like, what does a pop banger even sound like when it's coming from Robert Smith, the king of gloom? It's got to be interesting.
It is like a reminder that even in the darkest of times, life can still surprise you with moments of joy and beauty. Those moments become even more precious because of the darkness around them.
And that brings us back to that idea of legacy, right?
Yeah.
What does Smith want to leave behind with this album? And, maybe even with those two other albums he's working on. He said he sees them as a way to process his emotions, to make sense of his life. It's heavy stuff.
It is like
I
he's
know.
using music to grapple with those big questions of life and death, meaning and purpose. And in doing so, he's creating something that speaks to all of us on a human level.
Exactly. That's what makes The Cure so enduring, They tap into these universal emotions, loss, longing, the search for something more, and their music helps us make sense of those experiences.
It's interesting. The more we talk about this album, the more I realize how much the theme of time is woven into everything.
Yeah, it's there in the lyrics and the music, even in the context of the band's career.
Right. Smith's reflecting on his life, how he's gotten older, and musically there's this expansive quality to the sounds, like these long, drawn-out passages that like stretch out into infinity. It's like the music itself is reflecting the passage of time.
And then there's the fact that this is their first album in 16 years, and maybe it's the start of their final chapter. It's like the past, present, and future are all colliding on this one album.
It makes you wonder, what does it mean to create art when you're aware of your own mortality? What does it mean to leave a legacy when you know time is running out?
Those are big questions. And I think Songs of a Lost World encourages us to think about them, but it doesn't give us any easy answers.
It's like it's saying the journey is more important than the destination. That even as we age, even as we lose things, there's still beauty and meaning in the present moment.
Exactly. And maybe that's the message of this album. That even in the face of darkness and despair, there's still something worth holding on to, something worth fighting for. Whether it's love, art, or just the will to keep going. The Cure reminds us that we can get through even the toughest challenges.
And maybe that's why people are connecting with this album so strongly. It speaks to those universal experiences, those fears and hopes we all share. It's about finding meaning in a world that can feel really chaotic.
I think that's a perfect note to leave our listeners on as they start their own journey through Songs of a Lost World. We've given them the background, the insights, but now it's their turn to experience the music and see what it means to them.
Absolutely. We've talked about the darkness and the weight of this album, but I'm also curious to hear those moments of light, those unexpected turns that Mary's influence might have brought in.
Me too. It's those contrasts, those little sparks of beauty that often make the Cure's music so interesting. It's like they're reminding us that even in the darkest night, there's always the possibility of dawn.
So, to our listener, I think it's time to put on your headphones, dim the lights, and let Songs of a Lost World wash over you. Let yourself feel the emotions, think about those big questions it raises.
And remember, you're not alone in this. The Cure's music, it has this way of connecting us all, reminding us that we're all in this together, facing the good and the bad, the joy and the sorrow, the beauty and the pain, all of it.
I love that. It's like we're all part of this big human experience, and music is the language that helps us make sense of it all. Okay, but before we send our listener off on their own journey with Songs of a Lost World, let's talk about those other two albums Smith mentioned, the ones he's been working on since 2019. I mean, after 16 years of waiting for a new album, the idea that we might get three new albums in a short amount of time is pretty incredible.
It is. It makes you wonder what sparked this creativity in him.
Yeah.
Is it the grief, the sense of urgency we've been talking about, or is it something else entirely?
He doesn't really give us much to go on in the interview, just that he's almost done with the second one. It's like he's giving us a little peek behind the curtain, but not showing us the whole picture.
Right. It definitely adds to the mystery. What will these albums sound like? Will they continue exploring the same themes as Songs of a Lost World? Or will they be something totally different?
I guess we'll have to wait and see. But the fact that he's already so far along with the second one suggests that there's a lot of music waiting to be heard. A whole new chapter of The Cure waiting to unfold.
It's pretty exciting to think about, especially for a band that's been around for almost 50 years. They're still pushing boundaries, still making music that feels relevant and meaningful. It's pretty amazing.
It is. And it makes you think about legacy. What does it mean to have such a long and influential career? How do you balance what the fans expect with staying true to your own vision?
Those are questions that the Curie seems to be wrestling with right now, and it'll be fascinating to see how that plays out in their future work.
Hmm.
But for now, I think we should focus on Songs of a Lost World and encourage our listeners to really immerse themselves in the music.
Agreed. We've talked a lot about it, but ultimately it's the music that matters most. So to our listeners, we encourage you to listen closely, pay attention to the details, and let the Curie take you on a journey.
And as you listen, we want to hear from you. What resonates with you? What surprises you? What questions come up for you? Share your thoughts with us.
Because at the end of the day, music is a conversation, a shared experience that connects us all, so let's keep that conversation going. It's funny, this whole conversation has really highlighted how Songs of a Lost World is like this blend of looking back at the Cure's past and hinting at where they might go next.
Yeah, it's like a bridge between eras.
Yeah.
We hear those connections to albums like Disintegration, Pornography, especially in the mood, the overall feel.
Totally. That classic Cure sound, it's definitely there, but it doesn't feel like they're just rehashing old ideas.
No, not at all. This time, it's all filtered through, Smith's own personal journey, his experiences with loss and getting older. And the fact that he's working on those two other albums, it tells me he's still experimenting, still pushing the boundaries of what the Cure can be.
Which is amazing for a band that's been around for almost 50 years. Most bands would just be happy to coast at this point.
I know. It shows how much integrity they have, that they're not just going to turn out the same old stuff. Yeah. And it actually makes me think about art in general.
Ooh, I like it when we get philosophical. Tell me more.
Well, true art, it's never static, right?
Yeah.
It's always growing, evolving, reflecting the artist and how they see the world.
So even though this album has all those familiar Cure elements, it's still very much a product of this specific moment in time, shaped by everything Smith's going through.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting to analyze. It's familiar, but new.
Hmm.
Comforting, but kind of unsettling. Nostalgic, but looking ahead all at the same time.
It's challenging that idea that, artists become less relevant as they get older. Instead, it's saying that there's beauty in the journey and the wisdom that comes with age.
It's a powerful message,
Mm.
especially in a world that's so focused on youth.
Mm.
It's saying that all our experiences, even the painful ones, shape us, shape our art.
And that brings us back to you, dear listener. As you dive into Songs of a Lost World, keep all of this in mind.
Yeah, listen for those echoes of the past, but also be open to those new directions Smith is exploring. And most importantly, let yourself be moved by the honesty in his music, his words.
Think about how that album connects to your own life. How do you relate to those themes of loss, aging, searching for meaning? We all go through those things.
Because the most powerful art is the art that speaks to us personally, the art that makes us feel less alone.
So, dear listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this thought. As you listen to Songs of a Lost World, remember that you are not alone. The Cure's music has this amazing way of connecting us all, reminding us that we're in this together, facing the ups and downs of life with vulnerability, courage, and hopefully a sense of wonder. Happy listening.